and sold off to an equity firm earlier this year from Johnson & Johnson. So really a significant shifting in a multi-billion-dollar market around diabetes. And you can see this in our forecast, so you can't necessarily see the exact numbers, but we're talking around $10 billion total when it comes to this, and declining in original test strips, but then when you focus on the boost in terms of CGM revenues, you can see a report for full details of that. So between diabetes and cardiac, those are the two main markets, but as you've seen this morning and otherwise, there is a whole series of other applications which are possible. So these would be for general inpatient monitoring, so removing the wires from the patient in the hospital, allowing them to move around a lot more readily, yet still collecting an appropriate level of data that can happen. I've given some examples here. I'm a bit short of time, but things like, as the previous speaker was saying, we're looking at vital signs like heart rate, respiration rate, skin temperature, and so on. So all deployed in different scenarios. For example, this Leaf Healthcare one is specifically being backed by a couple of wound care companies looking at prevention of bed sore formation rather than at general monitoring as some of these others are, but all being kind of tried going forwards. Beyond the inpatients, there is also a move to try and do this in a more general population. There's less of a clear business model in some of these cases and a lot of work to do in terms of how these will be commercialized. But of course, these platforms can be deployed more widely, as we see, using the smartphone as a platform, as an interface, Bluetooth and similar technologies. So we heard this morning from Qualcomm Life how they have various patches available. I think they listed 17 different potential application areas ranging from epilepsy to MS to heart failure where they could use these sensors going forward. But also we see other platforms from competitive companies and other developers that are doing this. In temperature sensing, we see, again, a group of different areas. We've seen some examples this morning of how temperature sensing can be done by Bon Bouton, and also from, of course, VivaLink in the previous presentation. But generally, the two main applications that we're seeing at the moment are around fever monitoring and fertility tracking. So both associated with spikes in temperature at a certain time, which you can detect via a skin patch, and then deploy into a useful product that you can create actionable data from. Another area of great interest is around sweat sensing. So this can be around sweat rate, but also the biomarkers from sweat. So this has been largely focused on in generally academic and just post-academic research so far, but of great interest because you can potentially probe the body chemistry in a non-invasive way. So mostly staying in academic work, but there have been some moves towards integration of this into more commercial devices. Initially, the main theme across this whole community was in looking at glucose monitoring for diabetes management. However, it's pretty widely accepted now that this is going to be very, very challenging to do because of the issues in time difference between the spikes in blood glucose and then the spikes in sweat glucose. So what we're seeing is these kind of companies that have built these platforms moving to different alternative analytes they can analyze. So it could even be a lactate sensor, it could be something like an inorganic iron for sodium, potassium, other biomarkers, and sort of exploring potential applications in these areas. So just to sort of summarize what we did, we looked at pretty much, like I say at the beginning, every skin patch, electronic skin patch maker we could find. I think we found about 100 total product examples and across these spaces. And the idea was to collect as much data as we could on all of them, focusing predominantly on the ones that were more commercial, but also seeing how these different players are developing. And because we now have this data source, we can ask it questions. So one question we asked was, how skin patchy are the skin patches today, if skin patchy is a real word? So lots of people, when they're thinking about skin patches, will think about these super flexible conformal devices that sit right against the body, and you'll see many examples of companies doing it in the exhibition here today. But what we see is that the majority of skin patches deployed today, and this may be an obvious conclusion, but we sort of found it again in the data, is that most of them are electronic boxes that are stuck on the skin. Right. So a traditional electronics manufacturing, a couple of bespoke components, but then attached to the skin. And what we see is the sort of commercial maturity by application. So diabetes and cardiac up here with very sort of typically rigid performance. And then the less commercial sectors, things like what have we got here? So wound monitoring and treatment, aspects of some full body motion sensing and so on, can try and use these advanced platforms in the future. So what we now have is this data source. We're following all the different companies. Obviously we can leverage things like this show in order to do that, as well as traveling around the world as we do as analysts. So in place of that, the missed presentation, hopefully that was a satisfactory overview of this kind of electronic skin patches space. And if we have time, I'm happy to take any questions.